Well, hello, YouTube fans. It is me. I am back from the desert southwest and hanging out in the frozen tundra of Minnesota. It's currently minus 10 outside with about a foot of snowpack, but brilliant sunny day. So it is kind of nice to go outside and get into the sun as long as it's not windy. It's not all that bad, but not nearly as nice as the desert of the Southwest, Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas. And so I've been back for a few days and wanted to do a video a lot for my memories of the trip and the people I met, but to share it also with you. So I am titling this The Good, the Great, and the Ugly. So let's start with what is the good? These three people will center around people I met in Eureka over the course of a couple days that I spent there. And the first is the good. I was trying to get my bike onto the hitch. It was kind of precarious. The sidewalk is crooked. If you've ever been to Eureka Springs, this place is, there's nothing that's flat there. Everything's at an angle. It's a little beaten up on the sidewalks, and so I'm trying to get this bike up on a ramp from a driveway that's up top. So along comes this young man. His name is Corey, and Corey is a dude from Missouri, and he's riding a African twin, which he calls Black Knight. I'd say the guy's about 30, 32 years old, and he sees my bike, and first thing he wants to do is stop and say, "Hey, is that your bike?" And we were connecting along the lines of motorcycling and life in general and his pursuits in the world of motorbiking. And so we got along pretty well. And so I asked him, I said, "Hey, would you do me a favor and help me load the bike up?" And he said, "Sure." And, jumped off his bike, parked it in the middle of the road just about. It was kind of a weird scene on a back city street. So the bike wasn't totally protected, but he hopped off, helped me get the bike up and set it on the ramp, and we were good to go. We ended by sharing some Instagram addresses, a little bit of Facebook, that sort of stuff, and connected thereafter. So that was a good, cool guy. Stopped, Corey. Certainly an age difference, but commonality in the world of motorbiking connected us. When there's a lot of that connection that goes on through my life as I bike all over the world. So here's the great. The great is I'm at the same location, and it's an Airbnb, and I'm going to stay at this night. I want to stay in town and experience the Saturday night life in Eureka Springs. And she comes up. She's the owner, the renter, with her little son. He's probably 5 years old. And so he's very curious about the bike. I have a full-face helmet. I probably look like Darth Vader, black jacket and dark jeans, etc. And whip off my helmet, and the little boy comes up to me, and he hands me a flower and says, "Here, mister, here's a flower." And so his mother and I are having a conversation about, the lock where the Airbnb cottage is, which is around the corner, down and over a little bit. And he comes up, the little boy, and says to me, "Here, mister, here's a leaf, but it's a heart." It was so sweet, and he's just a typical little boy. He wants to touch the hot bike, and I have to keep him away from it, and, but it was kind of touching that he would give a stranger a flower and a leaf, and he's a young boy. So there's no preconceived notion about man and flowers and whether that's a femininity thing or not. I'm a stranger, and makes no difference to him. He just wants to express to me is his interest in what I'm all about, and that's how he does it. So I saved that flower in the leaf. Matter of fact, it's in the garage on the DR. It came all the way 1,000 miles back on the windshield. I bungeed it to the windshield, and in the little cottage that I stayed at, there there was a little write me book, and kind of put a little note in it. And so I said in that book, I said, whenever a young man gives you a flower and a heart-shaped leaf, you treasure it, and which I did. And so I want to preserve some of that memory because that was a great thing that in 5 or 10 minutes happened during my travels. So that's the great. So what about the ugly? So it's the same location. This man and a woman, the guy's probably about my age, overhears my conversation with Corey, the motorbiker, and heard my story about being retired and traveling, blah, blah, blah. So that aroused his curiosity. So Corey leaves. This guy said, "Hey, I heard you're retiring. Where are you from?" And I said, "I'm from Minnesota." And he goes, "Oh, that's where all the mop heads are." Mop heads? I said, "I've never heard of that expression. What is a mop head?" And his wife kind of looked a little guilty and ashamed. And he says, it's them Muslims. Those Muslims. They wear those things around their head called mop heads. And I said, well, geez, that's never heard that expression. I don't really like that kind of wording. And I said, diversity is what makes this country great. And Minnesota is a great state because it has people, has Somalia population, has Hmong population, has Russian. Original immigrants are, of course, from Norway, Sweden, and Germany. So it's a great mix of cultures here. And so I said, what makes America great is all the diversity. And he says, well, those people, they just want to keep to themselves and take advantage of us. I said, well, not that I see. And he said, well, everybody's immigrated from somewhere. Where were your parents from? He said, Czechoslovakia. I said, oh, well, thinking back to my history, Ceausescu was a dictator and kind of an asshole ruler. Everybody tried to escape his domination. I said something to that effect, and he said, well, my people came in legally. They're not coming in legally. I said, well, listen, buddy, I'll tell you what, I really don't care for minds that hate, and we really don't have much more to talk about. And kind of put his head down, and the wife looked really embarrassed about, imagine coming up to a total stranger and having this conversation. It's one thing if, you're your buddies and all like minds and you can swim in that ocean if you want, but to drag a complete stranger into that mentality was just an awful thing. So anyhow, it reminded me of that John Lennon song. Yeah, I have no time for minds that hate. So brother, you gotta wait. So that's my Eureka Springs good, great, and bad story. Just an addendum to all that, some interesting people I met along the way. Try to remember their names. I was over on the Colorado River camping on free public land, and there was people on either side of me. And big in that area is ATVing, the four-wheel drives, hillsides that go back for hundreds of miles, where you can just ride, ride, ride. And so these guys would come back and they'd check my bike out and they tried to get me to come out with them. And those are pretty technical rides. My bike really is a dual sport. It's not a dirt bike, at least the one I brought along. So it has mild off-road capabilities, but it's certainly not going to make 12-foot leaps and up some rugged terrain like they were taking these ATVs. They were flying. But they ended up coming up by and chatting with me every day and invited me to do some boondocking with them over east of Phoenix in what they called a saguaro forest, which sounded really cool. Um, and Dave and Jim were their names. And Dave gave me his phone number, and he had this big fifth wheel with a big trailer behind pulling the ATV, but he was very chatty, and they were both from Colorado. Probably our mindsets were completely different, but we didn't talk about politics. We didn't talk about religion. All we talked about is the love of being out camping, exploring, traveling outside of the cities into the desert, and that was our connection there. Uh, Long story short, it rained the day I was going to go there, and he had told me that if it rains, it wasn't very good to go back there because it washes out and can get really muddy. And I just have a rear-driven vehicle. They both had four-wheel drives, so didn't want to risk that. So I didn't meet them, but I have the location marked for when I go back. I'm gonna go. I got to go camping in this saguaro forest. Sounds so cool. Um, so that was Dave and Jim. Then further the story, I made my way down to Quartzsite and camped at some free public lands there. And it was playoff football time, and the only bar that had a TV set that had the NFL on was called the Grub Steak. So I went in there whenever the playoffs started, ordered some food, beer, and in comes this other couple. And the woman has a Pittsburgh Steeler shirt on. And so I say to her, "Oh, you're a Steeler fan?" Yeah, I'm a Steeler fan. "Where are you from?" I said, "I'm from Minnesota, but I'm a Steeler fan too." And I said that I spent 24 years in Pittsburgh and have been a longtime fan of the Steelers. And she said she grew up in Latrobe. And I said to her, I said, "You mean Latrobe, right?" And she looked at me like, "Wow, how do you know that's how they really pronounce it?" Uh, I said, "Well, I worked in Greensburg, which is just down the road, for about 2 or 3 years. That was my first job in Pittsburgh, and learned all the local pronunciations of the cities. So a lot of people call it Latrobe, but it's really Latrobe to the old timers there. So we connected and bonded, and both she and her husband watched the football games. You know, um, Connected on many levels. And I said to him, I said, "Well, gee, I spent the whole day here. I don't know where I'm staying tonight. I don't have a place picked out or anything." And they said, "Well, why don't you come with us? We're part of this Lance Trailer group. Lance Trailers are very nice, well equipped, high end small trailers." And so they invited me to stay with the Lance Trailer group. So we went back. It took me to, down 5, 6 miles of back roads and into the desert. And there I was, trusting, trusting. But it turned out to be a great time for 3 or 4 days. I spent time with this group. There were, people around my age. This Lance Travel group gets together, and they do socializing in camping spots. And this just happened to be one out in a place called Skadden Wash, which is free desert land to camp in Quartz. It's just outside of Quartzsite. So every night we would gather around the fire, tell stories, chat, drink a couple beers, crash. Next morning I get up, I'd do some writing or some things of interest and come back and do that kind of same scenario again with them. But it was a lot of fun. So we became, again, social media is out there. We became friends on Facebook. So Judy does a lot of posting, so I've been following her. And she even goes to Pittsburgh on Thanksgiving every year. She and her husband are currently, they're living in Jersey somewhere and retired, but they're still out west traveling. They're pulling their trailer with a little Toyota Tacoma, and they were out in the California desert and Lake Havasu and continue to go on and on. So I'm a bit jealous as I sit here in the frozen tundra of -10, wishing I was back there again. But so we've connected, and I'm following their trip and commenting, and uh, going back to Thanksgiving, we are going to connect again and get together one afternoon and just chat and have her meet my family, Mary and the kids. And she, Judy, and Glenn will be there. They're staying in Regent Park, and we'll stay out in the West End side of town. And so that's a connection I made. Another connection I made is my first day when I got south of Tucson, about an hour south. Beautiful, beautiful area. I stayed in a state campground. And I just, after driving 1,000 miles in 3 days, I just wanted to stay in one place and just hang out, do some riding, check out Bisbee, Patagonia, Sierra Vista, and Tombstone, of course, was there too. So, which I did. So, I was at my camp spot, and across the way was two people probably my age, and then a woman who was probably in her 30s, I think. And every night she would be out by herself. She'd be making a fire, hanging out, talking on her phone, smoking cigarettes, drinking something. And she commented that she liked my bike and wanted to take a picture of it, share it with her son. So one night, and her name is Chris. So I said, hey, I want to join you, come over around your campfire and just hang out for a couple hours, which we did, and kind of talked, not all night, but for a couple hours that night. I learned a lot about her life and her struggles. Coincidentally, she's from Pottstown, Pennsylvania, so another Pennsylvania connection. I knew exactly where that was, and she told me about her tragic part of her life was her marriage to her husband, and the fact that he's a paraplegic. He dove into a shallow pool and severed his vertebrae, and I don't know if this is all true, but it's very sad. So I have the gift of listening um, to people's tales, and I guess they feel comfortable talking to me about their past and histories. And in this case, she shared with me her whole struggles in life, and um, so it was an interesting evening. Not one of my favorites, but it was an interesting evening. And when you're on the road, you always look for some connection because it's tough sometimes just being by yourself and you're in your head all the time, and that's okay. But sometimes you like to get out and talk to the real world. So that was Chris from Pottsville, Pennsylvania, and then the other people we became friends with, and this is a pretty interesting story. Mary flew to Tucson, and then she and I camped the whole way to Austin. And we stopped, and I made a video about this Lost Maple Vineyard, where it's a Harvest Host group, where they allow you to come in and just camp on their lands. In exchange, you go in and you do wine sampling, buy a bottle of wine, talk to the owners. It was a real nice night. And they happened to be there too. So they were driving their large Class A, towing a Jeep behind it. And when they pulled in, they were out for the day riding around the Jeep, and Mary and I were setting up camp, and we invited them to come over and chat with us a little bit, which they were, all for. The guy was, I think his name was Jordan, and he was an interesting character, just really mild mannered, clear-minded, had interesting questions. He wanted to know about you, and so we kind of connected on that level. And his wife, she was kind of outgoing and bubbly, kind of like Mary. So we had a strong connection. We sat after dinner. We sat around another campfire, which we built up a campfire right next to the outdoor kitchen that was there. And we talked the evening, and we learned that he was a police officer. I never would have guessed that. He was a police officer. He had just retired. They sold their home, sold all their belongings, and bought this big RV, brand new, and a Jeep to tow behind it. And they were out exploring the world, or exploring the USA. And we had, always okay, you're police officers, and then they talked about they're packing guns. They're both got handguns on board, and we talked a little bit about our dislike of weapons and the terror that it does, not only in mass shootings, but every day you read about people being shot by crazy people with guns. Guns are not a good thing in our mind, but we talked about it and kind of defended our territory a little bit, but nothing, nothing outrageous, and we kind of just accepted. Well, he's a police officer. He's trained, knowledgeable. I mean, if anybody's going to own a gun, you want these kinds of people to have that awareness on how to manage weapons in this crazy world. But they're from Jacksonville, Florida. Um, Probably a little younger than me, around Mary's age, maybe or so, but definitely had a different background in terms of their upbringing and their values. Well, I say our core values are kind of pretty much the same, just our love of being outside and enjoying and traveling and meeting people, and those kinds of things. A glass of wine that we had with them, maybe two. Uh, it ended up to be a real nice evening. Again, social media, we're now connected. I'm following them all over the place. And I think her husband is a really good guy. And she's again the social media in the family, and he is the tour guide, I guess. So let's see. Any other interesting people we met along? We stayed at a B&B in Las Cruces, and it was called the Inn of the Arts. And we stopped into town, and we had just gotten in. We were hungry, wanted to get out, go to the walking. The town was within walking distance. Go down and grab a bite in town. And the owner who had not greeted us initially, came up to us. She was an older woman, and her personality was such that I think her name was Lindeen. Lindeen, yes. Personality was such that she just wanted to be in your face and look at me. She was wearing turquoise and studs, and, and she's like, 80 years old. Chatty, 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 chatty. And so anytime she was around, she was like, pronto, right there. Wanted to have that conversation and get so you can hear all about her. Basically, it wasn't too much about you. Although I did have a little fun with her. The next morning, she and another person that were staying there, they had to guess what my occupation was, and I wouldn't tell them what it was. So they played the guessing game, and they went on for half an hour trying to guess my occupation. I took them down a wrong path and misled them a little bit, and told them I was a finance guy and made all my money as a young man and hadn't worked for years, and kind of made up a little story just to make it a little more interesting than a guy who ran a garden center for the last 15 years. Uh, so, Lindeen, if you're out there, you're a sweet woman, but man, back off a little bit. Even at breakfast, man, she was right there. But a beautiful, interesting place, lots of cool art and uh, different types of art, and a unique building. Her husband knew Frank Lloyd Wright. She told us that, and he was an architect, and he had passed away a few years ago. So she is probably using the inn as a means of socialization. Back to that thing, we all need people to connect to in our lives to make ourselves feel alive, right? So anyhow, those are the highlights of people that I met along my journeys. Eventually Mary and I made it back to Austin. We stayed there for a few days, just having fun in the town, exploring it. I missed my buddy Ravi was out of town, so we couldn't get to see him. After that, she flew back, and that's when we decided that I'd come back to Minnesota for a few days, about 10 days, just to recoup a little bit from the travels. And it's tax time. We have to get all that shit organized and go through the mail, do your laundry, shovel the driveway several times, all that good busy type work. So in a few more days, we are going to head to Fort Myers, where I'm going to go for about 3 weeks, visiting some friends. Mary's coming down for a week. Fortunately for me, she's still working, so she's the breadwinner, and I'm the play guy, I guess. So I'm her tour guide. So I have her connect with me on my trips, and we go out and do a bunch of fun things. So, well, that is the update as to the good, great, and the ugly. Man, he was ugly. Hate people like that. And one last look at the frozen tundra out the other side of the house. And there it is, -9 now. It's going to warm up this weekend, so we'll have a good time, I'm sure, somewhere doing something. But my, it's cold and beautiful. Well, I hope you enjoyed my stories. And as I said, I did this somewhat for my own sake and to share a little bit about stuff that I learned. There's a little picture of my family right there. And the cool thing about YouTube is that, it's there. It's kind of a history lesson for me, and maybe my kids' and kids' might learn a little bit about who I am and the shit that I've done. So, well, that's it. I got some honeydews to do, so time to get on with it. So, hope you enjoy. Bye.